Hello, fellow instrumentalists. I'm Jacques Gadway, and today we're going to be talking about something that I found recently while browsing the r/violin subreddit. I have been noticing in that subreddit that there's a recurring question that keeps getting asked, and while there's a lot of advice that I think is actually quite good, I noticed that my response is rather unique, and yet it's something that I firmly stand behind. So I thought I'd make this video to thoroughly explain my answer to the question I keep seeing: how do I improve my intonation? There are many different ways to improve intonation, but today we're going to talk about three concepts that I use in my teaching and in my own playing in order to better my intonation and that of my students. The last of these three is potentially the most important piece of advice that I can possibly give. But first, let's talk about the first two concepts related to intonation work. I suspect the reason that most people turn to r/violin to ask this kind of question is because they really want to find a new answer. They don't want to keep hearing the same answer over and over again. Surely there's another way, right? Surely I don't have to just practice scales over and over again. Yeah, scales practice is probably one of the best and most productive ways to learn how to play in tune. I'm sorry to say it, but don't worry, that's not what this video is about. In fact, right now we're going to talk about the first two concepts that are related to intonation growth and how to practice them. Of course, we have to build up our hand and we have to build up our ear. First, let's talk about how to build up the hand. Of course, you already knew it was coming. We're going to talk about scales. To build up our hand, the first suggestion I would give is to simply practice scales. Specifically, I would say practice 2-octave scales without shifts. This means you'll be playing each scale starting on the G string, and as a result, you'll be able to practice every single finger on every single string within that key signature. The reason that this is a very useful tool when practicing and developing your hand in your intonation is because it addresses one key difficulty with the intonation on the violin. Aside from the fact that the violin does not have frets, which we already know, there's another aspect of violin playing and really string playing in general that can affect our intonation. This is the fact that our relative finger length changes depending on what string we're playing. If you look closely at your violin and you look at the way that your hand is organized, you can see that on the G string, your left hand fingers are actually shorter relative to when they're on the E string. This is because when you place your fingers on the G string, they have to travel all the way across the fingerboard. This means that some of the length of your finger is being used to cross over those strings, and therefore your relative finger length left in order to place on the string is actually decreased. On the other side of that, when you place your fingers on the E string, they don't have to cross over the fingerboard at all, and as a result, they're actually much longer relatively. And so that affects our intonation in a couple of ways. Generally, what I see happen in students is the most logical of the outcomes, which is that when they play on the G string, because their fingers are relatively shorter, they play relatively flat. And then when they play on the E string, because their fingers are relatively long, they tend to play relatively sharp. If we take our finger just to demonstrate as a straight line next to the E string, you can see that the point that it contacts the string is much further along than if we rotate it over to the G string. Well, much further might be an overstatement. But the fact is that that half centimeter or full centimeter in difference makes a great deal of difference in terms of our intonation. So practicing 2-octave scales across the strings gives our hands the chance to memorize and learn the necessary compensations in order to maintain good intonation while crossing over strings. So I would practice 2-octave scales of different key signatures, but always starting on the G string on a low finger, like either first finger or second finger, so that way you don't actually have to shift and you can practice going across the strings. For example, if we take the key of A, and you would go down, of course, and then if we take the key of B flat, and then, of course, we can speed these up, we can add slurs, we can do all sorts of things, but the bottom line is that we're focusing on making sure our intonation is good, and we're building up this natural intuition as to how our fingers have to adjust across the strings. Another important aspect of intonation in the hand is the idea of hand frame. This is essentially talking about the relationship between the first finger and the fourth finger. The idea of hand frame describes that the first and fourth finger, when played in tune, give a very healthy frame to the hand, and the resulting in-between notes have a much easier time and a very clear frame of reference in order to play in tune. When practicing 2-octave scales across the strings, if we ensure that we use fourth fingers each time, this is one method in developing a good hand frame. Because if our fourth finger and first finger on the corresponding string are in tune, then we're again developing that relationship between 4 and 1. Practicing arpeggios is another great method for practicing hand frame because it skips over notes and actually develops the relationships between further apart fingers, like 2 and 4, 1 and 4, and 1 and 3. We can see this exemplified in, let's say, the B-flat major arpeggio. If we start on a second finger, we're developing our relationship between 2 and 4, and then 1 and 4. And if that 1 and 4 relationship is in tune, then we're building up that natural intuition of what our hand frame should look like. Another way to practice hand frame, and one of the ways that I do daily also, is for more advanced students, and this is to practice octaves. Practicing octaves is very beneficial, and there's two things that I absolutely love about them. The first thing is that when you play an octave out of tune, it is so extremely obvious. You get this kind of wobble in the sound, this wobble in the pitch, and that's because the wavelengths that are interacting between octaves should interact perfectly. In fact, the hertz, or the frequency between octaves, should always be doubled. So if you're playing an open G, the waveform of that is going to be moving half as fast as the waveform of the upper G, which means that those waves are going to interact quite pleasantly. However, if one of those two notes is even slightly ajar, they're going to interact violently, because now all of a sudden, instead of perfectly lining up 2 to 1, they're lining up perfectly wrong. They're like 2.1 to 1. And so we get this really discordant wave that we can actually hear and experience. It's very unpleasant. So because of how obvious it is, it's a great tool for developing hand frame. Because when we're playing our first finger and fourth finger together, we immediately know if it's in tune or not. Even if we don't have a sophisticated ear, we can still hear just from the sheer sound of the sound wave, the fact that it actually sounds quite discordant. So essentially, practicing octaves allows the laws of physics to actually help us in our intonation work. Another reason that I like practicing octaves is because it builds up intuition in the hand again. Much like how practicing 2-octave scales builds up the intuition in the fingers of how they need to naturally compensate for the changing finger length, practicing octaves, specifically practicing octave scales, builds up a natural intuition in the hand frame as to how it has to change as you increase position. You may not know this, or you may already know this, but in violin or any stringed instrument, as you go up the fingerboard, the size of intervals actually shrinks. And this is another crucial detail that explains part of why intonation is so difficult. If you ever looked at a fretted instrument, it becomes visually very clear. On my mandolin, for example, you can see that the frets get closer and closer together as we go down this neck, or in violin, we would say up the neck. And that's because the distance physically shrinks as you go up the neck or across the strings. This means that our hand needs to learn how to do that intuitively. And one of the greatest things about octaves is that when we practice them over and over again, we begin to build an intuition in the hand of how that first finger and fourth finger need to get closer together, the exact rate of which is built through, again, this kind of natural intuition that only comes from this kind of practice. Now, in order to truly benefit from this kind of handwork that we've been talking about, we need to know that where we're placing our fingers is correct in the first place. How can we build up the hand or benefit from all the scales and octaves if we're not actually hearing that we're correct? So there's two things that we can do to build up our ears that are involved with practicing and using the violin. The first thing and most obvious, and actually a pretty frequent answer I see on Reddit, is to use a tuner. This is an option that I think is actually okay if you're more of a novice or more of a beginner or intermediate, and your ear is not so well developed. However, using the tuner can often create a dependency and doesn't actually necessarily build your ear. It just shows you to use visual cues like whether or not the note is showing up above or below the center of pitch, and then adjusting your hand from there. Rather than that, I think one of the most beneficial ways of building up your ear is to do drone practice. And part of the difficulty with drone practice is it's hard to pick a drone when practicing a piece of repertoire, because the repertoire will move throughout different key centers, and it'll be hard to decide what drone you're going to use for what section. However, in scales, that's not the case at all. In fact, it's very easy to pick which drone to use when you're practicing a scale because that's the name of the scale. If you're practicing an F scale, for example, just set a drone to F. I specifically recommend you use these drones from the Cello Drones album. You can find them on YouTube, I'll post a link below, and you can also find them on Spotify. Practicing with drones is a great way to actually build your ear because it teaches you to listen for the differences in the kinds of waves that you're hearing come out of your instrument. When you hear a drone in the air, and by the way, I would recommend you practice drone practice without headphones. You should do it playing on a speaker because we actually want to hear our violin or our string interact with the drone that's enveloping the space. As I mentioned when talking about octave practice, different notes have different wave frequencies, and each of these notes are going to interact with each other differently. When you have a drone set to, let's say, an F, and you're playing an F major scale, every time you play an F, it should beautifully ring. And if you play that F out of tune, just like in the octave practice, you're going to hear it begin to stutter. It's going to actually literally affect the sound that you're hearing in the room. Other notes in the key of F are going to sound beautifully pure as well. The notes that you should expect sound extremely clean are going to be the B flat, the C natural, and of course the F. That's because all three of those notes create perfect intervals with the F drone that you'll hear. All that perfect intervals are describing when a note has a waveform that has a perfect relationship to another. When we are talking about an octave, the relationship between the high F and the low F is going to be within the wave frequency, a 2-to-1 relationship. When we're talking about perfect fifths, it's another beautiful relationship. In this case, I believe it's 3-to-2. These kinds of relationships produce a totally beautiful and pure sound, and you can come to learn to listen for it through practicing this kind of drone practice. Each other interval creates their own kind of sound profile, and listening for them and learning them is part of why drone practice is so useful, because it actually trains your ear into listening for these kinds of sounds. I would absolutely recommend that you practice with a drone, especially when doing scales. Perhaps you don't have to do it with octaves, because octaves can tend to take care of themselves, as mentioned before. Now, let's talk about the final and most crucial piece of advice I can give about intonation. This is perhaps the most important piece of advice that I can give you about intonation work. The most important thing that you can do in your practice is something that I make sure all my students understand, though I doubt all of them do, and that is that you need to not adjust your fingers. If you play something out of tune, don't just smear the finger to fix it. Because think about what you're trying to build when you're practicing. You're trying to build good finger placement. Good finger placement. That means that we're trying to build the skill of placing the finger in the exact place. If instead, however, we consistently place the finger in the incorrect place, and then we subsequently adjust it by smearing it across the string, we're actually not building good finger placement. We're building the habit of placing the finger wrong and quickly adjusting. This is potentially one of the biggest causes of poor intonation in the playing of students, and even some professionals that I know. So when you practice your scales or any kind of intonation work, just be very careful of the habit. And you'll notice it, I'm sure, every time you practice now, that it is your habit to change. It's still something that I do, and I actively have to fight against it. We don't want to change the position of our fingers after we've placed it wrong. Instead, the solution is to place it, if incorrect. Let's say we're trying to play C natural, little high. We, instead of smearing, we're going to lift the finger, understand that we're sharp, and replace the finger with the information that we've gained from the mistake. We know we were sharp, so the second time we place it, we're going to place it a little lower. And if we're wrong still, or we overcompensated, we again do the same process. We lift, we use the information of the mistake, and we make a correction. So those were my 3 pieces of advice with regards to intonation development. If you have anything that you do in your practice that you'd like to share with me, or any of the people watching this video, please leave them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and make sure that you don't miss any future videos like this one.